I almost didn't take that train. That's the thing I keep coming back to, even now, months after everything unraveled. I almost didn't go. I stood in the kitchen of the house Nathan and I had shared for 22 years, coffee going cold in my hand, looking at the train ticket on the counter like it was something dangerous. Like it already knew what was waiting for me at the other end of the line. My name is Vanessa Holloway. I was 54 years old, recently widowed, and so tired I had stopped being able to tell the difference between tired and broken. My husband Nathan had died 11 weeks earlier. A heart attack, they said, sudden and without warning, the kind that doesn't give a person time to say goodbye. The kind that leaves a wife standing in a hospital corridor, being told by a doctor half her age that the man she'd built her entire adult life around was simply gone. I had not cried as much as people expected me to. That bothered some of them, I could tell. My sister-in-law, Margot, had looked at me at the funeral with something close to suspicion, like dry eyes were evidence of something. But I wasn't dry-eyed because I didn't feel it. I was dry-eyed because I felt it so completely that it had moved past tears into something else. A kind of hollow, ringing silence that lived in my chest where Nathan used to be. The house felt wrong without him. Not sad, exactly. Wrong. Like a word you've said so many times it stops meaning anything. And now I had to travel to Harwick, a small city 4 hours away by rail, where Nathan's family had deep roots and where the bulk of his estate was apparently tied up in property, holdings, and accounts I hadn't known existed until the lawyers contacted me 3 weeks after the funeral. That was the first surprise. I had known Nathan was comfortable. We were comfortable together. We had a decent house, no debt worth losing sleep over, savings that made me feel secure but not wealthy. Nathan had worked in financial consulting for 30 years. He was careful with money the way careful people are, quietly, without drama, without flash. He drove an 8-year-old Volvo. He bought store-brand cereal. He had never once mentioned an estate. The letter from the law firm, Greer, Calloway and Associates, had arrived on a Tuesday. It was written in the flat, bloodless language that lawyers use when they want to seem professional and end up sounding like robots. But the meaning underneath it was clear enough. Nathan Holloway had assets, substantial ones. Property in Harwick, investment accounts, a family trust that had apparently been structured before we even met. The firm requested my presence for the formal reading of the estate at their offices on the 15th. I'd called them, of course. I'd spoken to a man named Gerald Calloway, who had a voice like expensive furniture, smooth, polished, a little cold. He confirmed everything in the letter and told me not to worry, that the process was straightforward, that I should bring identification and any relevant documents. He used the word straightforward 3 times in one phone call. I'd learned enough in 54 years of living to know that when a person calls something straightforward that many times, it is almost certainly not. But what choice did I have? Nathan was gone. The house had a mortgage that I couldn't cover alone on what I made part-time working bookkeeping for a small nonprofit. Whatever Nathan had left behind in Harwick, whatever this estate was, I needed it, not out of greed, out of the simple, unglamorous arithmetic of survival. So I packed a bag, I bought a ticket, I stood in the kitchen and drank my cold coffee and told myself it was going to be fine. I almost believed it. The train station in our town was small, 4 platforms, a coffee kiosk that was never fully stocked, and plastic seats bolted to the floor in the waiting area that had been designed by someone who clearly didn't want people to get too comfortable. I arrived 40 minutes early because Nathan had always said that being early was the only form of punctuality that counted, and even in his absence I couldn't shake his habits. The platform was mostly empty that morning, a young couple with too much luggage, a businessman in a gray coat talking into his phone, with the intensity of a man whose life depended on the outcome of whatever conversation he was having. And near the far end of the bench row, half hidden by the shadow of a support column, a man sitting alone. He was somewhere between 50 and 70. It was hard to tell. His coat was army green, frayed at the collar, the kind of coat that had started its life belonging to someone else entirely and had passed through several hands before landing on his. His shoes didn't match in shade, though they were the same style. He had a canvas bag on the ground between his feet, and he was sitting very still, not looking at his phone, not reading, not fidgeting the way people do when they're waiting. Just sitting, watching. I noticed him the way you notice anyone who exists a little outside the normal rhythm of a place. Not with alarm, just awareness. I sat down 2 benches away, set my bag on the seat beside me, and pulled out the folder of documents I'd brought. The lawyer's letters, Nathan's death certificate, my ID. I had organized everything the night before into labeled sections because organizing things was how I managed not to fall apart. I was reading through Calloway's letter for the 4th time, looking for anything I'd missed, when I heard it. Vanessa. Not loud, not strange in its tone, just a voice, a man's voice, low and slightly rough, like someone who hadn't spoken much that day, saying my name. I looked up. It was the man in the green coat. He was looking directly at me. My first thought was that I must know him, that this was someone from town, someone I'd met at some event, someone Nathan had introduced me to years ago, and whose face I'd simply filed away in the wrong part of my memory. I studied him. I went through every database I had, Nathan's colleagues, our neighbors, people from the neighborhood association, faces from the nonprofit, faces from church, faces from everywhere. Nothing. I'm sorry, I said, because that's what you say. Do we know each other? He didn't smile. He didn't look away. No, he said, but I know who you are. I've been waiting for someone like you to finally show up. The hair on the back of my neck did something it hadn't done in years. I should have left. I know that now. I should have moved to the other end of the platform, put my headphones in, stared at my phone like a normal person. But something about the way he said it, not threatening, not unhinged, but weighted, like every word had been measured before it was released, kept me exactly where I was. Someone like me, I repeated. The widow, he said. Nathan Holloway's wife. Going to Harwick for the reading. The folder slipped in my hands. I caught it, but barely. How do you know that? My voice came out steadier than I felt, which surprised me. He reached down into his canvas bag. For one terrible second, I had no idea what he was going to pull out, and every ridiculous fear a person can have crowded into my head at once. What he actually produced was a folded piece of paper, so worn along the creases, soft with age, like it had been opened and refolded 100 times. He held it out toward me. I didn't move. I'm not going to hurt you, he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost gentle. I've been waiting for someone with the nerve to actually go and claim that estate. I didn't know it would be you, but I'm glad it is. Why? I asked. Because, he said, you're the only person in that whole situation who hasn't already been bought. I took the paper. I don't know exactly why. Some combination of stubbornness and the very specific kind of recklessness that grief produces. The feeling that the worst has already happened, so what exactly is there left to be afraid of? I took the paper, unfolded it, and looked at what was written there. It was a name, a date, and an address in Harwick. The name was one I didn't recognize, Dolan Crow. The date was 31 years ago. The address was listed as the site of a property that, I would learn only later, no longer existed. What is this? I asked. The beginning, the man said. He had moved slightly, settled his bag more carefully between his feet, and was watching me with eyes that were dark and very calm. My name is Elias Crow. Dolan Crow was my father. I stared at him. And what does your father have to do with my husband's estate? Everything, Elias said. Your husband knew that. He spent the last 2 years of his life trying to prove it. He paused. Let that land. Mrs. Holloway, the people waiting for you in that law office in Harwick, do you know how long they've known about this reading? I assume since Nathan died. They've known for 4 months, he said. They were informed before Nathan died, and in those 4 months they have moved a significant amount of money into accounts that don't appear in any of the documents they're going to show you. The platform had started to fill. Somewhere behind me, the departure board clicked and updated. My train was 12 minutes away. Why are you telling me this? I asked. You don't know me. I'm a stranger to you. Elias looked down at his hands for a moment. They were rough hands, calloused, weathered, the hands of someone who had done hard physical work for years, or had lived hard, or both. Because your husband asked me to, he said quietly. Not directly. He didn't know about me specifically, but he left a trail. And I've been following it for longer than you'd believe, waiting for someone who cared enough about the truth to follow it the rest of the way. He looked back up. I thought it might be nobody. I thought they might have bought off everyone close to him. But here you are, on time, with your folder. He almost smiled. Not quite. You're going to need more than that folder, he said. I boarded the train in a state that I can only describe as controlled vertigo. The feeling of the ground being slightly wrong underfoot, of the familiar world having shifted just a few degrees off its axis in a way that made everything look the same but feel fundamentally different. Elias Crow boarded the same train. He sat 4 rows back, in a window seat, and he didn't speak to me again until we were past the city limits and the landscape had opened up into fields and gray November sky. He came forward and sat across from me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Tell me what you know, I said finally. Tell me what you know first, he said. So I did. I told him about the letter from Greer, Calloway and Associates, about the phone call with Gerald Calloway and his 3 uses of the word straightforward, about not knowing the estate existed, about the shock of realizing that Nathan, who bought store-brand cereal, who drove an 8-year-old Volvo, had quietly accumulated something significant enough to require a formal legal proceeding to distribute. Elias listened without interrupting. He had the particular kind of patience that doesn't perform itself. It was just there, solid and real, the patience of someone who had been waiting a long time. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. How much did they tell you the estate was worth? He asked. They were vague. The letter said substantial holdings. It's worth approximately $4.5 million, he said, in real property, investments, and a family trust that's been compounding for 30 years. The train jolted slightly over a rough section of track. I held on to the armrest. $4.5 million, I repeated. That's what it should be worth, Elias said, if everything were accounted for. The question is how much of it is still there, and how much has already been moved. By whom? He leaned back. Did Nathan ever mention his family to you, his cousin specifically, a man named Raymond Holloway? I thought about it. Nathan's family was not a topic he'd lingered on. There had been a falling out years before we met, something he described as a difference in values, which I'd understood to mean something significant had happened, but that he didn't want to detail it. He had one cousin, Raymond, whom he mentioned perhaps twice in 22 years, always briefly and always with a flatness in his voice that said more than his words did. Once or twice, I said. He didn't talk about him. Raymond Holloway has been in contact with Greer, Calloway and Associates for the past 6 months, Elias said. He has been contesting the structure of the trust. Not publicly, not through formal channels yet, but in private correspondence. He believes, or claims to believe, that the trust was structured improperly and that he has an equal claim to its assets. Does he? No, Elias said flatly, but that's almost beside the point. The point is that while he's been making noise about his claim, other things have been happening in the background. Account movements, document amendments, transfers that were made with Calloway's knowledge and possibly his facilitation. By the time you walk into that office for the reading, the landscape is going to look very different from what Nathan actually left. I stared at him. Outside, the fields moved past in long, gray-brown stretches. How do you know all of this? I asked. How does a man in a train station, in that coat? I stopped because that sentence was going somewhere rude. Elias didn't seem offended. In this coat, he said, as if completing the sentence was no trouble. Know things like this. He reached into his bag and produced a manila envelope. He set it on the table between us. My father was Dolan Crow. 31 years ago, he was an accountant at a firm that managed financial records for a family called Holloway. He discovered what he believed was a significant fraud, assets that had been misrepresented for tax purposes, records that had been falsified, a pattern of financial manipulation going back decades. He reported it. He was prepared to testify. Yaman. He paused. What happened? I asked. He was discredited, Elias said. The Holloways, specifically the older generation, Nathan's uncle, a man named Garrett Holloway, had the resources to fight it. They found inconsistencies in my father's own records, minor things, meaningless things, but enough to cast doubt. The case was dropped. My father lost his job. We lost our home. He looked at the envelope on the table. I was 9 years old. My mother raised me alone after that. My father never fully recovered from what was done to him. He died 12 years ago, never having seen any of it set right. The train was quiet around us, the soft mechanical sound of movement, someone 2 seats ahead listening to music through headphones, a child somewhere at the back of the car asking its parent a question in a high, persistent voice. Nathan knew this? I asked. Nathan found out, Elias said. I don't know exactly when. I believe it was when Garrett Holloway died and Nathan inherited access to certain private records. I think what he found in those records shocked him enough to start digging on his own. He pushed the envelope slightly closer to me. Inside this envelope is everything my father documented 31 years ago. Copies. The originals are in secure storage, but complete copies. I also have documents that I've gathered over the past several years, following the same trail my father followed, with better tools. Why didn't you go to the authorities yourself? I did, he said quietly. Twice. The first time I was told there was insufficient evidence. The second time I was told the statute of limitations had expired on the original fraud. He looked at me steadily. What's being done now? What Raymond Holloway and Calloway are doing now, and that's not 30 years old, that's current, and that requires someone with standing to contest it. Someone like a widow, I said. Someone like Nathan's wife, he said. Someone with legal standing as a beneficiary. Someone who hasn't been bought, who doesn't know enough yet to be afraid. I looked at the envelope. You don't know that I haven't been bought, I said. You've known me for 40 minutes. I know you drove an 8-year-old Volvo, same as your husband, he said. I know you work part-time at a nonprofit doing bookkeeping for about $30,000 a year. I know you organized your documents into labeled sections, and you showed up 40 minutes early for your train. He paused. I know Nathan Holloway loved you, and I know that a man like Nathan, careful, principled, deliberate, does not love someone who can be bought. I picked up the envelope. We had 3 hours left on that train, and by the time we reached Harwick, I had read everything in Elias Crow's envelope twice. The documents his father had compiled 31 years ago were meticulous, the work of a careful man, an accountant's mind, organized and cross-referenced and annotated in handwriting so precise it was almost architectural. Dolan Crow had documented a pattern of financial manipulation spanning more than a decade, centered on the Holloway family trust. Assets misclassified. Income underreported. A network of shell entities through which money had been moved to reduce the trust's apparent value for tax purposes, while the actual wealth accumulated elsewhere, shielded. It was sophisticated. It was deliberate. And it had clearly been constructed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had legal help doing it. The name that appeared most frequently in the older documents, besides Garrett Holloway's, was a firm called Pelham and Garst. I had never heard of them. Elias told me when I asked that Pelham and Garst had been absorbed by Greer, Calloway, and Associates approximately 15 years earlier. I read that 3 times. So Calloway's firm, I started, inherited the relationship, Elias said, and everything that came with it. The newer documents, Elias's own research, showed patterns that echoed the older ones, not identical in mechanism but recognizable in structure. Money moving through accounts in ways that were technically legal but designed to obscure. A series of amendments to the trust documents over the past 18 months, each one individually minor, collectively significant. And the private correspondence between Raymond Holloway and Gerald Calloway. Elias was careful not to tell me how he'd obtained it, and I was careful not to ask, which made clear that both men were aware of the estate's full value and had taken steps to ensure that the version of it presented at the formal reading would be considerably reduced. They're going to offer you a settlement, Elias said, as the train began its deceleration into Harwick Station. Calloway is going to present a figure that sounds reasonable. They're going to have the documents ready. They're going to be very professional about it. And the rest of it? We'll have already moved, he said, or we'll be in the process of moving. The reading is tomorrow. I believe some of the transfers are timed to coincide with the day of. I looked out the window. The city was appearing now. Buildings, streets, the particular gray density of a place that had been settled and resettled over generations, that carried its history and its architecture whether it wanted to or not. "What do I do?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning," Elias said. "Before you go to that office, I need you to meet someone. An attorney I know. Not connected to any of this, completely independent. Her name is Patricia Vance. She practices in Harwick. She already knows the situation in broad strokes." He paused. "She was waiting to see if you'd actually come." "Everyone has been waiting to see if I'd come," I said, and there was an edge in my voice that surprised me. "Yes," he said simply, "because it mattered who you were." The train stopped. Around us, people began collecting their things, standing, pulling bags from overhead compartments. The ordinary machinery of arrival. I looked at Elias Crow, this man in the wrong shoes and the frayed green coat, this man who had been waiting on a cold platform with a folder of his dead father's documents, this man who had spent years following a trail that had destroyed his family and then waited, patient as stone, for someone to show up who might finally be able to do something about it. "You should have had better options than me," I said. He looked at me. Something shifted in his face. Not quite emotion, but something adjacent to it. Something that had been held back for a long time and was very carefully not being released. "Nathan thought you were the best option anyone could ask for," he said. He wrote it down. "I'll show you." I picked up my bag. My hands were steady, which amazed me. "What hotel are you at?" I asked. He hesitated, just slightly. "You don't have a hotel," I said. "I'll be fine," he said. "That's not what I asked." I looked at him directly. "There's a second bed in the room I booked. It's not an offer, it's practical. I need someone in this city who knows what I'm walking into, and you're the only person I've got." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. We walked off the train into Harwick together, the November air sharp and cold, the city unfolding ahead of us with its secrets still locked inside. And somewhere in that city, in a law office with polished furniture and fluorescent lighting, people who had been stealing for a very long time were preparing a very professional presentation designed to make sure I never knew the difference. They had not counted on Elias Crow. They had not, more critically, counted on me. That night I sat at the small desk in the hotel room while Elias slept. Or didn't sleep, I couldn't tell. He was quiet either way. And I went through everything again. Every document, every annotated page from Dolan Crow's careful, devastating records, every piece of Elias's own research. And somewhere in the third hour of reading, I found the thing that finally made me understand what Nathan had died knowing. It was a letter, handwritten, tucked into the very back of Elias's folder, not from Dolan Crow. The handwriting was different, more hurried, less precise. The handwriting of someone who was writing fast because they felt the pressure of time. It was signed at the bottom with a name I would have recognized anywhere. Nathan. My husband had written a letter. He had addressed it to no one, or to whoever found it, which was its own kind of address. And in it, in his hurried handwriting, he had laid out everything he'd found, everything he'd pieced together from Garrett's old records, the fraud, the shell entities, the way it had destroyed a man named Dolan Crow and Dolan's family, the way the same mechanisms were being used again, updated for the current generation. He had written, "I don't know how much time I have. I don't know if this will reach the right person. But if it does, if you're reading this and you care about the truth, then please, don't let them do it again." I sat at that desk in a hotel room in Harwick at 2 a.m, and I did something I hadn't done in 11 weeks. I cried. Not the controlled, manageable kind. The other kind. The kind that comes from somewhere deep enough that it shakes your whole body and sounds nothing like dignity and doesn't care. Because my husband, my careful, quiet, store-brand cereal husband, had known. He'd known what his family had done. He'd known what it had cost people. And he had spent the last 2 years of his life trying to fix it, carrying that weight alone, not burdening me with it, working in the quiet and careful way he did everything. And then his heart had given out before he could finish. But he had left a trail. He had left me. Across the room in the other bed, I heard Elias shift. Then stillness again. "I found the letter," I said quietly. A pause. "I know," he said. "I thought you'd want to find it yourself." I wiped my face with the back of my hand. Outside the window, Harwick was dark and quiet, the streets mostly empty, the occasional car moving through the night. Tomorrow, I said, I'm going to need you to tell me everything, every name, every account, everything you have. Yes, he said. And then we're going to walk into that office, I said, and we're going to be very, very prepared. Elias was quiet for a moment. Your husband believed in you completely, he said. I thought you should know that. I looked at the letter in my hands. Nathan's handwriting, Nathan's words. The evidence of 2 years of quiet, determined, exhausting work that he had never told me about because he hadn't wanted to frighten me, or because he hadn't wanted to be wrong, or because he was Nathan, because he carried things alone and did the work first and asked for help second, always, his whole life. I know, I said. I just wish he'd trusted me enough to tell me while he was alive. The night settled around us. Somewhere outside, a car passed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. Tomorrow, everything would change. I just didn't know yet how completely. I didn't sleep more than 2 hours. By 6 in the morning, I was already at the desk again, showered and dressed, with Elias's documents spread in front of me in the order I'd decided mattered most. Patricia Vance, the attorney Elias had mentioned, was meeting us at a diner 3 blocks from the hotel at 7:30. The formal reading at Greer, Calloway and Associates wasn't until 2 in the afternoon. That gave us time. Not a lot of it, but enough if we used it right. Elias woke without an alarm, which told me something about the kind of sleep he was used to. The light, surveillance kind. The sleep of someone who had learned not to go too deep because the world had a habit of moving without warning. He sat up, looked at me at the desk, looked at the documents, and didn't say good morning. He said, "Which ones are you unsure about?" I pointed to a cluster of pages in the middle of the pile, account transfer records dated 8 months ago that showed money moving through an entity called Harwick Capital Group. This one, I said, I can't figure out how this connects to the trust. He came over, looked at it for about 10 seconds. Harwick Capital Group is a shell, he said, registered in Delaware 18 months ago. Raymond Holloway's wife is the listed agent. His wife, I said, her maiden name. That's how they did it. Calloway drafted the registration documents. He straightened up. Patricia will be able to explain the legal implications better than I can. She's seen this structure before. I looked at him. In the morning light, without the drama of the train station and the revelation of the night before, Elias Crow looked exactly like what he was. A tired man in his mid-50s who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. There were lines in his face that didn't come from age alone. His eyes were clear, though. Whatever the years had taken from him, they hadn't taken that. "Did you eat yesterday?" I asked. He blinked. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." I picked up my jacket and my keycard. "We're leaving in 20 minutes. Put your shoes on." Trusek. The diner was called Marcy's, and it smelled like coffee and fried butter, and the particular warmth of a place that had been feeding people through hard mornings for decades. We got there first. Patricia Vance arrived 4 minutes later, and she was not what I'd expected. I don't know exactly what I had expected. Someone severe, maybe. Expensive. The kind of attorney who weaponizes their competence and makes sure you feel it. What walked through the door instead was a black woman in her early 60s, compact and brisk, in a dark blazer and sensible shoes, carrying a leather portfolio that was scuffed at the corners from use. She had reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she moved like someone who had been in a hurry for approximately 40 years and had made peace with it. She slid into the booth across from us, looked at me directly and said, "You're Vanessa Holloway. I'm Patricia. I've been following what's happening with this estate for about 2 months. I'm glad you came." She looked at Elias. "I'm glad you found her." "She found herself," Elias said. I just pointed. Patricia ordered coffee and eggs without looking at the menu and opened her portfolio. "Tell me what you know," she said to me. "All of it. Don't summarize. I want the details." So I told her. Everything from the letter, to Calloway's phone call to Elias on the platform, to the documents, to Nathan's letter at the back of the folder. I talked for almost 30 minutes without stopping, and Patricia listened the way good attorneys listen, completely, without expression, taking occasional notes in handwriting so small it looked like code. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She drank her coffee. "The Harwick Capital Group transfers," she said. "How much, total?" Best I could calculate, somewhere between 800,000 and 1.2 million, I said. The records Elias has aren't complete. There are gaps. There are always gaps, she said, not bitterly, just factually. That's how they do it. Enough documentation to look legitimate, enough gaps to create deniability. She tapped her pen on the table. Here's what you need to understand walking in there today. Callaway is going to present you with an estate valuation. It will be professionally prepared, legally formatted, and it will look complete. It will not be complete. The question is not whether they're hiding assets. I'm confident they are. The question is whether we can demonstrate that clearly enough and quickly enough to stop any additional transfers before they're finalized. Can we? I asked. Depends on what you're willing to do, Patricia said. She looked at me steadily. If you sign anything today, anything at all, our leverage gets significantly smaller. So the first rule is you do not sign. Whatever they put in front of you, whatever Callaway says, whatever Raymond Holloway or anyone else in that room says, you do not put your name on a single document today. They're going to push, Elias said. Of course they're going to push, Patricia said. That's fine. Pushing is not the same as forcing. You're a beneficiary, not a defendant. You have every right to take time to review, to consult independent counsel, that's me, and to request full disclosure of all assets associated with the trust. She closed her portfolio. I've already filed a preliminary inquiry with the county court this morning. It's not an injunction yet. I don't have enough for that. But it puts a flag on certain transactions. It makes it harder for them to move quickly. I looked at her. You filed that this morning? Before we even met? I filed it on the basis of what Elias told me last week, she said. I told you. I've been waiting to see if you'd come. She picked up her fork. Eat something, Mrs. Holloway. You're going to need to be sharp this afternoon, and sharp is harder on an empty stomach. We had 4 hours before the reading, and I used them. Patricia walked me through every document, explaining in plain language what each one meant legally, what it demonstrated, what it couldn't prove on its own. Elias filled in the background, the family history, the relationships, the way the older fraud under Garrett Holloway had been structured, and how its mechanisms had been recycled in updated form by the current generation. By the time we walked out of that diner at 11:30, I understood the shape of what had happened to Nathan's family fortune. Not every detail. There were still gaps, still things we couldn't confirm without access to documents that were locked inside that law office. But the architecture of it was clear. And understanding the architecture was enough to know where to look and what questions to ask. What I hadn't been prepared for was the moment we turned onto the street where Greer, Callaway, and Associates had their offices, and I saw Raymond Holloway standing on the sidewalk outside. I hadn't seen Raymond since Nathan's funeral, and even then only briefly. A man in an expensive suit at the edge of the gathering, quiet and watchful. The kind of quiet that isn't peace, but strategy. Nathan's cousin was 61 years old, silver-haired, and had the particular kind of good-looking that money maintains into middle age. The gym, the tailoring, the careful management of appearance. He was on his phone when we approached, and he saw me at the same moment I saw him. He hung up. "Vanessa," he said. The warmth in his voice was so practiced it was almost impressive. "I didn't know you were already in town. You should have called. I'd have arranged a proper dinner last night." "I was busy," I said. His eyes moved to Elias standing slightly behind me, and something happened in Raymond's face. A flicker, fast as a shutter closing, that he covered immediately with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't think I know your—" "He's with me," I said. "Shall we go in?" Raymond's smile stayed exactly where it was. "Of course," he said. "Of course. This is a difficult day, I know. Nathan was—" He paused, performed something that resembled grief. "He was family. Whatever differences we had, he was family. I want this process to go smoothly for everyone, especially for you." "I'm sure you do," I said, and walked past him through the door. The offices of Greer, Callaway, and Associates were exactly what that phone call had suggested. Polished, impersonal, designed to communicate authority without warmth. Pale wood paneling, good carpet, art on the walls that was clearly expensive and communicated nothing. A receptionist who had the kind of precise efficiency that made you feel like she was processing you rather than greeting you. Gerald Calloway met us in the conference room. He was younger than his voice had suggested, late 40s, maybe 50, with silver-rimmed glasses and a careful haircut, and the smooth, unhurried manner of someone who had spent his entire career in rooms like this, managing situations like this, saying one thing with words and another thing with posture. He shook my hand with both of his, which I had always found to be the handshake of someone who wanted to signal sincerity while providing none. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I'm so glad you made it. I know the journey from—" "I'd like to begin as soon as everyone is seated," I said. "I have questions about the documentation, and I'd prefer to have time to address them." Something moved across Calloway's face. Not alarm. He was too controlled for that. A recalibration. "Of course," he said. "Absolutely. We have everything prepared." There were 4 people in that conference room besides myself and Elias. Calloway. Raymond, a younger attorney named Fitch, who was clearly Calloway's associate and who had the slightly haunted look of someone who knew more than they were comfortable knowing. And a woman I didn't recognize, late 40s, dark suit, introduced to me as Diane Holloway, Raymond's wife, the woman whose maiden name was on the registration documents for Harwick Capital Group. I looked at her for a moment longer than was polite. She looked back with perfectly composed neutrality. "Let's begin," Calloway said. He presented the estate valuation first. It was, as Patricia had predicted, a professional document, bound, tabbed, clearly organized. It placed the total value of Nathan's estate at approximately $2.8 million, comprising 2 properties in Harwick, a portfolio of investments, and the family trust. $2.8 million, not 4.5. I let him finish his presentation. I let him explain the trust structure, the 2 properties, the investment accounts. I let Raymond make a quiet comment about how he hoped this could be resolved in a way that honored Nathan's memory. I even let Calloway begin the segue toward what he called a proposed settlement framework, the moment Patricia had warned me about. Then I opened the folder I'd brought. "I have some questions about the valuation," I said. Calloway's hand stilled on the table. "Of course, what would you—" "The trust," I said. Nathan's grandfather established it in 1971. According to the original trust document, which I have a copy of here, it was structured to compound annually and was explicitly protected from transfer or division without the written consent of all primary beneficiaries. I looked at him. Nathan was the sole primary beneficiary after his parents passed, which means any amendment to the trust structure after that point would have required Nathan's written consent. "Can you show me the consent documentation for the amendments made in the last 18 months? The room was very quiet. "Those amendments were routine administrative updates," Calloway said carefully. "Standard language modernization. I'd still like to see the consent documentation," I said. "If Nathan signed off on them, there should be records." Calloway looked at Raymond. It was brief. Most people would have missed it. I didn't miss it. "I'll have to pull the specific files," Calloway said. "We can certainly schedule a follow-up meeting to—" "I'd also like the full accounting for Harwick Capital Group," I said. The air in the room changed. I felt it, a pressure shift, like the moment before weather. Raymond set down his pen, very carefully. "I'm not sure I know what you're referring to," he said. "Harwick Capital Group," I said again, "registered in Delaware. The listed agent is your wife." I looked at Diane Holloway. Her composure was still intact, but there was something around her eyes now, a tightness. Between 14 and 22 months ago, a series of transfers moved funds from accounts associated with Nathan's trust into Harwick Capital Group. Those transfers are not reflected in this valuation. I tapped the bound document on the table. "I'd like to understand why." Calloway leaned forward. His voice had dropped in temperature. "Mrs. Holloway, I understand this is an emotional time. Losing a spouse is—" "Don't," I said. And something in my voice, flat, cold, nothing like the careful restraint I'd been managing all morning, made him stop. "Don't talk to me about my emotions. Talk to me about the money." Raymond's expression had shifted entirely now. The warmth was gone. What was underneath it was harder and less patient. "Vanessa," he said, using my first name in a way that was meant to feel like authority, like he was reaching across the table to take my arm and steer me somewhere. You've clearly been talking to someone who has given you a very distorted picture of, my husband left a letter, I said. Silence. He documented what he found in your grandfather's records after Garrett died, I said, looking directly at Raymond. He named the shell entities. He named the accounts. He identified the pattern. I paused. He also named what happened to Dolan Crow 31 years ago. The man your grandfather destroyed for trying to report exactly this. Raymond looked at Elias for the first time since we'd sat down. Really looked at him. And I watched something happen in Raymond's face that wasn't a flicker this time. It was a full reckoning, a sudden understanding of exactly who was sitting across this table from him and what that meant. You're Dolan's boy, Raymond said quietly. Elias said nothing. You have no standing here, Raymond said, and the veneer was entirely gone now. The voice was something colder and more real underneath. Whatever documents you think you have, whatever story you've been selling this woman, he hasn't sold me anything, I said. He showed me what your family has been doing for 30 years, and what you and Calloway have been doing for the past year and a half. And I'm not here today to sign anything. I looked at Calloway. I'm here to tell you that I have independent legal representation, that a preliminary inquiry has already been filed with the county court this morning regarding certain asset transfers, and that I intend to contest this valuation in full. Calloway had gone very still. Fitch, the younger attorney, was looking at the table with the expression of a man calculating the distance to an exit. That's your right, Calloway said, after a moment that was about 3 seconds too long. Of course that's your right. I know it is, I said. I stood up. Elias stood up beside me, and I looked at Raymond Holloway one last time across that polished table, in that polished room, surrounded by the architecture of 40 years of careful, practiced theft. Nathan knew what you were, I said to him. He spent 2 years of his life building the case against you. He didn't get to finish it. I picked up my folder. I will. Met. We walked out of Greer, Calloway, and Associates into air that felt like the first clean breath I'd taken all day. Patricia was waiting in a car at the curb. We got in. She looked at my face and said, how bad? They know we know, I said. Calloway tried to manage it. Raymond didn't. Raymond never could, Elias said quietly from the back seat. He's like his grandfather that way, confident right up until the moment he isn't. Patricia pulled away from the curb. Tell me everything they said, word for word, as close as you can manage. I told her. All of it. The valuation figure, the moment I named Harwick Capital Group, the way the room had shifted, Raymond's face when he recognized Elias. She listened, asked 2 precise questions, and then was quiet for a long moment. The consent documentation doesn't exist, she said finally. I'd bet everything I own on it. Those amendments were made without Nathan's knowledge. Can you prove it? I asked. Not yet, she said, but I know someone who might be able to help us get there. She glanced in the rearview mirror at Elias. You said your father kept originals. In secure storage, he said. Yes. We're going to need them, she said, because what Vanessa just described in that room, Calloway's reaction, Raymond's reaction, that tells me the thing they're most afraid of is exactly what we think it is. The original fraud. 30 years old, never properly prosecuted, and now with a direct line from what Dolan Crow documented to what's happening in that trust right now. I looked out the window. Harwick moved past. Its streets, its buildings, its ordinary afternoon people who had no idea that inside a conference room a few blocks back, something had just cracked open. Raymond's going to move fast now, I said. He knows we're coming. Yes, Patricia said, which means we have to move faster. She took a turn I didn't recognize, heading toward a part of the city I didn't know, and in the back seat Elias Crow sat with his canvas bag on his knees and his eyes on the road ahead. I thought about Nathan, about the letter, about 2 years of quiet work carried alone. I thought about Dolan Crow at 9 years old, watching his family come apart because his father had tried to do the right thing. I thought about Raymond's face when the warmth dropped away and the real thing showed itself underneath. There are moments when you understand exactly what a person is, but not what they present, not what they've constructed, but the actual thing at the center. Raymond Holloway had shown me his center this afternoon. It was exactly as ugly as I'd suspected, and he had no idea yet how much Nathan had left behind. Patricia drove us to a storage facility on the eastern edge of Harwick, a low-concrete building behind a chain-link fence, the kind of place that exists in every mid-size American city and holds the overflow of people's lives without judgment. Elias had the code. He'd had it memorized for years, which told me he'd been here before, possibly many times, checking on the thing his father had left him the way some people check on a grave. The unit was small, a single overhead bulb, metal shelving along both walls, and on those shelves, banker's boxes. 8 of them, labeled in handwriting I recognized from the documents Elias had shown me on the train. Dolan Crow's handwriting. Precise, architectural, the mark of a man who believed that careful record-keeping was its own form of integrity. Patricia put on her reading glasses and went to work without ceremony. Elias helped her. I stood near the door in the narrow space and watched the two of them move through 30 years of a dead man's evidence, and I felt something that I didn't have a clean word for, a kind of weight that was also a kind of purpose, the feeling of standing at the exact place where something important was going to happen and knowing that you had to be equal to it. "Here," Patricia said, after about 20 minutes. She was holding a folder, open, tilted toward the light. Transaction records from 1989 through 1993. Cross-referenced with the Holloway family trust account statements. She turned a page. And here, correspondence between Garrett Holloway and a man named Peter Garst. Garst was the senior partner of Pelham, and Garst before the merger with Callaway's firm. "What does it say?" I asked. She read for a moment. Her expression didn't change, but something in her stillness shifted. The stillness of a person who has just found exactly what they were looking for and needs a second to absorb it. "It says," she said carefully, "that Garrett Holloway explicitly instructed Garst to restructure the trust records to underreport assets by approximately 40% for the purpose of reducing estate tax liability." She looked up. "And Garst confirmed receipt of those instructions and indicated he would handle it." She held the letter slightly toward me. "This is not legal strategy. This is conspiracy to commit tax fraud in writing from the principal himself. Nathan found this," Elias said quietly. It wasn't a question. "He must have," I said. "It's exactly what he described in his letter. The pattern, the shell entities, the underreporting." I looked at the boxes around us. "How much of this is like this?" "Enough," Patricia said. "Enough to build a case that isn't circumstantial." She was already pulling out her phone. "I need to call someone at the State Financial Crimes Division. I've worked with an investigator there before, a woman named Torres. Good, careful, not the kind to move fast and break things." She looked at us both. "This is the point where this stops being a private legal dispute and becomes something larger." "How much larger?" I asked. "Larger than Callaway," she said. "Possibly larger than Raymond." She paused. "Vanessa, I need you to be prepared for the fact that what Nathan uncovered may go beyond what any of us have fully mapped yet. These families, the kind that operate like this for this long, they don't do it alone. There are facilitators. There are people who look the other way because looking away was profitable." She closed the folder carefully. "Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Nathan in our kitchen. Nathan with his store-brand cereal and his 8-year-old Volvo, carrying 2 years of this in his chest while I sat across the breakfast table from him and talked about ordinary things. "Yes," I said, bumped. Patricia made her call outside the storage unit while Elias and I waited in the narrow space between the shelving. He was looking at the boxes with an expression I couldn't entirely read, something that had grief in it, and something that had relief, and something else that didn't have a name. "Your father would have wanted this," I said, because it felt true even if it was also inadequate. Elias was quiet for a moment. "My father wanted a lot of things," he said finally. "He wanted his job back. He wanted his reputation back. He wanted to look his colleagues in the eye again without seeing what he saw in them after everything happened." He ran one hand along the edge of a shelf. "He didn't get any of that. He got boxes in a storage unit and a son who spent 20 years angry on his behalf. And now?" He looked at me. "And now there's a chance that it actually meant something. That he was right, and that being right still counts for something, even this late." I nodded. I didn't say anything else. Some moments don't need more words. Patricia came back in. "Torres is interested," she said, but very interested. "She wants to meet tomorrow morning. She's going to bring a forensic accountant." She looked at the boxes. I've asked her to come here directly. We're not moving these documents until there's an official chain of custody established. What about Calloway? I asked. And Raymond? They know we're coming. They have tonight to move whatever they haven't moved yet. They also have the preliminary inquiry sitting on certain accounts, Patricia said. That's not a full freeze. I was clear about that, but it complicates rapid transfers. Moving money now would generate exactly the kind of paper trail they've been trying to avoid. She pushed her glasses up. They'll meet with their own attorneys tonight. They'll look for a way to discredit what we have. They may try to reach out to you directly. Let them, I said. Patricia almost smiled. Don't answer without me present. Raymond called me at 8:47 that evening. I almost didn't recognize the number. I had it in my phone from years ago, an entry I'd never updated or deleted, the kind of contact you keep out of inertia rather than intention. I stared at the screen for 3 rings, then looked at Elias, who was sitting at the hotel room desk going through photocopies Patricia had allowed us to make before she'd locked down the storage unit. It's Raymond, I said. Elias looked up. You don't have to answer. I know, I said, and answered. Vanessa. His voice was different from what it had been in the conference room. Not warm. Raymond didn't do warm anymore. We were past that. But careful. Calibrated. The voice of someone who had spent the evening with their attorney and come away with a strategy. I want to talk. Just us. We can talk, I said. Say whatever you want to say. A pause. I could almost hear him deciding how to frame it. I think we got off on the wrong foot today, he said. You came in with a lot of misinformation, provided by someone with a very old grudge against this family, and things escalated in a way that wasn't productive for anyone. Elias Crow isn't misinformed, I said, and his grudge isn't old. It's 30 years of documented fact. Vanessa. The carefulness frayed slightly. Dolan Crow was a disgruntled employee who made accusations he couldn't substantiate. That was adjudicated. It was over before Nathan and I were adults. It wasn't adjudicated, I said. The case was dropped because your grandfather had the resources to drown it. That's not the same thing. Silence on the line. You're making a serious mistake, Raymond said. The warmth was gone again. This was the real voice, the one I'd seen under the table this afternoon. Harder. A little dangerous. You don't understand how complicated Nathan's estate actually is. You don't understand the years of work that went into structuring it. You think you're protecting something, but you're about to tear apart an arrangement that will hurt you as much as anyone. What arrangement? I asked. The settlement Calloway proposed, he said slowly, like speaking to someone he'd decided wasn't quite keeping up. 2.8 million, clean, no complications. Transferred to you within 60 days. That's not a small number, Vanessa. That's more than most people. It's not what Nathan left, I said. It's what's left after you and Calloway helped yourselves. The silence this time was different, heavier. That's a significant accusation, he said. It's a documented one, I said. Harwick Capital Group, registered to your wife. 14 to 22 months of transfers. And correspondence between Garrett and Peter Garst that goes back 30 years, laying out the original structure of what your grandfather built. I paused. Patricia Vance has already been in contact with the State Financial Crimes Division. There's going to be a meeting tomorrow morning. The sound on the line changed. His breathing or the absence of it. You don't know what you're doing, he said. I'm doing what Nathan spent 2 years trying to do, I said. I'm finishing it. I hung up. My hands were shaking, not from fear. I want to be precise about that. From the specific physical aftershock of confrontation, the way the body processes intensity after the fact, when the adrenaline has nowhere left to go. I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed my palms flat against my thighs and breathed. Elias had stopped pretending to read the documents. He'll move tonight, he said. Whatever he can. Patricia said the preliminary inquiry complicates it. Complicates isn't stops, Elias said. He stood up. I should call her. Already texting her, I said, phone in hand. Patricia's response came in 40 seconds. Already on it. Don't worry about tonight. Worry about tomorrow. I put the phone down, looked at the ceiling. Thought about Raymond in whatever room he was in, with his attorneys running calculations. Thought about Calloway doing the same. Thought about the boxes in that storage unit. Dolan Crow's careful handwriting on 30 years of evidence sitting in the dark, waiting. "Tell me something about your father," I said to Elias. "Not about the case. About him." Elias looked at me for a moment, slightly surprised by the shift. "He liked baseball," he said finally. "He took me to games when I was small. He could explain the statistics of any play in about 30 seconds, in a way that made complete sense." He paused. "He cooked better than my mother, which she admitted freely, and he never mentioned to be kind." Another pause. "He believed that if you did the right thing consistently enough, the world eventually had to account for it." "He wasn't wrong," I said. "He was wrong about the timeline," Elias said. I didn't have an answer to that because he was right, and we both knew it. Dolan Crow had been right, and it had cost him everything and taken 30 years for the accounting to begin. That wasn't justice. That was just what had happened. But it was beginning. That had to count for something. Torres arrived at 9 the next morning with a forensic accountant named Kim and 2 colleagues I was not introduced to by name, but whose presence communicated authority in the quiet way that certain professionals carry it. Patricia was already at the storage unit. Elias and I arrived 7 minutes after Torres. The next 4 hours were unlike anything I had experienced before or since. Torres was a small, methodical woman in her mid-40s who asked questions in a particular way. Precise, sequential, never leading, always following the document rather than the narrative. She and Kim went through Dolan Crow's boxes with the focused efficiency of people who had done this before and understood exactly what they were looking for. Patricia sat beside me along one wall and explained quietly what each significant find meant in terms of building a legal case. At 11:15, Kim held up a document and said, "Patricia, look at this." Patricia went over. They spoke in low voices for about 2 minutes. Then Patricia came back to where I was sitting. "The trust amendments," she said. "The ones from 18 months ago. Kim found the consent documentation." "Nathan signed them?" I asked, and my stomach dropped. "Nathan did not sign them," Patricia said carefully. "The signature on the consent documents is Nathan Holloway's name. It is not Nathan Holloway's signature." She let that settle. "It's a forgery, Vanessa, a competent one. It would pass a casual review. But Kim has Nathan's original signature from the trust establishment documents from 20 years ago, and the two don't match in 11 specific ways." I sat very still. My husband's name had been forged. While he was alive. While he was digging through his grandfather's records, building a case against his cousin, they had been forging his signature to gut the very trust he was trying to protect. "Can that be proven?" I asked. "With a professional document examiner, yes," Patricia said. "Torres is going to request an emergency preservation order on all documents held by Greer, Calloway, and associates relating to this estate. That means Calloway cannot destroy, alter, or transfer anything while the investigation is active." She looked at me steadily. "This is no longer a civil dispute about estate valuation, Vanessa. This is criminal." Torres appeared in the doorway. She looked at me with the carefully neutral expression of someone who has seen many bad things and has learned to process them professionally, but underneath which something human occasionally surfaces. "Mrs. Holloway," she said, "I'd like to ask you some questions about your husband's health in the last 2 years. His stress levels, any concerns he expressed, anything that seemed unusual." The question landed somewhere unexpected. "You want to know if they could have known he was ill," I said slowly, "if they timed any of this around his health." Torres said nothing, which was its own answer. I thought about Nathan, the last year. He had been quieter than usual. I had attributed it to the research, to whatever he was carrying that he wouldn't tell me about. He had been tired. He had lost some weight. He'd had a checkup in January and the doctor had mentioned elevated blood pressure. Nothing alarming. Here's a prescription. Keep an eye on it. He was under significant stress in the last 2 years, I said. He was doing something that weighed on him, that he carried alone. I looked at Torres. His blood pressure was elevated. His doctor addressed it in January, about 10 months before he died. Did he have regular checkups before that? He was consistent every year. And his previous checkups? Any similar findings? No, I said. He was healthy. He was always very healthy. Torres nodded, made a note. "I'm going to need his medical records, with your authorization as next of kin. I'm not suggesting anything definitive. I want to be clear about that. But in cases involving this level of financial manipulation, we look at everything. Look at everything, I said. After she left, Elias came and sat beside me. He didn't say anything for a moment. You think they knew, I said. I think, Elias said carefully, that my father's health also deteriorated faster than it should have after the pressure started. I have thought for a long time that sustained, targeted stress, the kind that comes from powerful people making your life systematically worse, does things to the body that don't show up in any single medical record but are real nonetheless. I looked at my hands. If they knew Nathan was sick, I said slowly, if they knew he was running out of time, that's why they moved when they did. The amendments 18 months ago, the Harwick Capital Group transfers, they were racing him. And they thought they'd won, Elias said. When he died, they thought it was over. I stood up. My legs were steady. My voice when I spoke was steadier still. We need to be at the reconvened reading, I said. Calloway sent a notice this morning. He's rescheduled for 3 o'clock. He thinks he's still managing this. He doesn't know what Torres found this morning. Should we tell Patricia? Patricia already knows, I said. She was copied on Torres's preliminary notes an hour ago. I picked up my jacket. Calloway is going to walk into that room at 3 o'clock, expecting a grieving widow who got a little difficult yesterday and has since been managed. He is going to walk in with his forged consent documents and his shell company and his very professional demeanor. I looked at Elias. He is going to be incorrect about what he walks into, I said. The conference room at Greer, Calloway & Associates at 3 o'clock looked superficially identical to how it had looked the previous afternoon. Same pale wood, same expensive nothing on the walls, same carpet, same table. But the people around it had changed. Patricia was with me. Elias was with me. And Torres, who had called ahead, who had spoken to Calloway personally about an official inquiry that was now formally open, was standing near the door in a way that was not aggressive but was absolutely unmistakable in what it communicated. Raymond arrived 4 minutes late. He saw Torres first, and the color left his face in a way that was almost clinical to watch, like a system shutting down in sequence. Calloway was already seated. He had seen Torres. He had known she was coming. His attorney, a different person from yesterday, someone brought in overnight, someone more expensive, sat beside him with a legal pad and the expression of a professional getting paid enough to look unruffled. Mr. Calloway, Patricia said, before he could say anything, we're going to move through this efficiently. We have the original trust documents, including establishment records from 1971. We have correspondence between Garrett Holloway and Peter Garst, your firm's predecessor, explicitly outlining the original fraud structure. We have a forensic analysis indicating the consent signatures on the 18-month-old trust amendments are not consistent with Nathan Holloway's authenticated signature. And we have records of the Harwick Capital Group transfers that are not reflected in the estate valuation you presented yesterday. The room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system. We are prepared, Patricia continued, to present all of this in formal proceedings. However, Mrs. Holloway has authorized me to say that if full and accurate disclosure of all estate assets is provided today, completely, with documentation, she is prepared to cooperate with investigators in a manner that focuses accountability appropriately. Calloway's new attorney leaned over and murmured something. Calloway didn't move. Raymond was still standing near the door. He had not sat down. He looked at me across the room with an expression I will carry for the rest of my life. Not the false warmth, not the cold strategy, but something underneath both of those things, something that might have been the first honest look I'd ever gotten from him. It was not remorse. I want to be clear about that. It was the look of a man who has just understood that the thing he thought was safely buried has been standing up this whole time, right in front of him, and he simply hadn't recognized it. Nathan knew, Raymond said. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It was almost like he was saying it to himself. Nathan knew everything, I said. He just needed someone to finish it. Calloway's attorney said quietly but clearly, my client would like to request a recess to consult. 10 minutes, Torres said from the door. Not a suggestion. They filed out, Calloway and his attorney, Raymond and the man who had come with Raymond. Diane Holloway, who had not spoken a single word the entire time, and whose face had the particular fixed quality of someone who has been rehearsing composure for 20 years and is finding the limits of their rehearsal. The door closed. Patricia exhaled. Elias sat down. I stayed standing because sitting felt wrong, because my whole body was still braced for the next thing. The way you stay braced after the collision has already happened. Your reflexes still processing an impact that's already passed. You all right? Patricia asked me. No, I said, but I will be. Torres looked at me from across the room. You handled that well, she said. There was no performance in it, just observation. My husband did the hard part, I said, and I meant it completely, every word. The 10 minutes Calloway's attorney had requested became 23. I know because I watched the clock on the wall of that conference room the entire time, the kind of institutional clock with a sweep second hand that makes time feel more precise than it actually is, each second announced rather than passing quietly. Patricia used the time to review notes. Torres made a call in the hallway, speaking too low to hear through the door. Elias sat with his hands flat on the table, completely still, in the way I had come to understand was not calm, but the disciplined management of something that wasn't calm at all. I stood at the window and looked at Harwick. It was an ordinary afternoon out there, people walking, a delivery truck double parked on the corner, a woman pushing a stroller who stopped to look at her phone and then kept moving. The world doing what the world does, continuing, indifferent, full of people who had no idea that in this room, something that had been running for 30 years was finally running out of road. When the door opened, Calloway came back in alone. His attorney was not with him. Raymond was not with him. Diane was not with him. Just Calloway, in his silver-rimmed glasses and his careful suit, looking like a man who had aged approximately 5 years in 23 minutes. He sat down. He folded his hands on the table in front of him. He looked at Patricia first, then at Torres, and then, last and longest, at me. My client, his attorney said from the doorway, which was as far as she came back into the room, is prepared to provide full disclosure of all assets associated with the Holloway estate. Patricia didn't move. All assets, she said, including those held through Harwick Capital Group and any other vehicles not represented in yesterday's valuation. A pause that felt like swallowing something difficult. All assets, the attorney confirmed. Torres said, Mr. Calloway, I'll need you to remain available for a formal interview with my office. We'll schedule that before end of business today. She paused. Is Mr. Raymond Holloway still on the premises? He left, Calloway said. His voice was flat in a way that was new. All the managed smoothness gone, just the sound underneath, which was tired and a little hollow. Torres looked at one of her colleagues who left the room without being told twice. I watched Calloway sitting there across that polished table. This man who had managed the Holloway family's financial arrangements for 15 years, who had inherited a fraud from his firm's predecessor and continued it, refined it, updated it with modern mechanisms and current shell company structures. This man who had called me on the phone and said the word straightforward 3 times, who had shaken my hand with both of his and called this process uncomplicated. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something closer to grief with the sharp edges left on it. Not for Calloway, not for Raymond, but for the years this had run. For Dolan Crow, for Nathan, for the distance between when the right thing should have happened and when it actually did. Mr. Calloway, I said, and he looked at me. Did you know about the original fraud, Garrett Holloway and Garst? He was quiet for a moment. His attorney made a small sound from the doorway. You don't have to answer that, his attorney said. I know, Calloway said. He kept looking at me. Yes, he said. I knew when the firm acquired Pelham and Garst's client list. There were records, context. He stopped. I made a choice. You made several choices, I said. Yes, he said again. Just that. The next several hours were procedural in a way that felt surreal against the intensity of everything that had preceded them. Torres and her team took over a secondary conference room. Patricia worked alongside them, reviewing documents as Calloway's office produced them, a process that involved at least 3 trips to locked filing cabinets and a server room down the hall. Elias and I sat in the waiting area on the same polished chairs, drinking coffee that the receptionist brought without being asked, because apparently even in the middle of an investigation, she maintained her professional habits. At some point, a man from the county assessor's office arrived, which Patricia had apparently arranged in advance. Then a representative from the state bar, which Torres had apparently arranged. The waiting area began to feel like a staging ground. At 5:40, Patricia came out with a sheet of paper and sat down beside me. Total confirmed asset value, she said, including the Harwick Capital Group holdings, 2 additional investment accounts that weren't in yesterday's valuation, and a property in the name of a second shell entity we identified in Callaway's records. The full estate is $4.3 million. $4.3 million. Close to what Elias had told me on the train. And the original valuation they presented was 2.8, I said. They had moved or obscured approximately 1.5 million, she said. Some of it is recoverable immediately. Some of it will take time. The Harwick Capital Group accounts have to be unwound through Delaware, which is a process. How long? Could be months. Could be longer for the portions that went deeper into the shell structure. She folded the paper. But it's documented. It's on record. And with Torres's investigation open, none of it can move further. I looked at the paper in her hands. $1.5 million that Raymond and Callaway had moved out of what Nathan had built, out of what Dolan Crow had tried to protect 30 years ago, out of what an entire family's labor and legitimate wealth had generated over decades. Raymond, I said. What happens to Raymond? Torres's team caught up with him, Patricia said. He didn't go far. He's at his hotel, apparently. She spoke to him an hour ago. She paused. He's retained a criminal defense attorney. That's all I know. She looked at me carefully. Vanessa, I want to be honest with you about something. Raymond is going to fight this. Not the disclosure, that ship has sailed, but the criminal exposure. He has resources, he has contacts, and criminal proceedings take time. This is not going to resolve cleanly in 30 days. I know, I said. Do you? She said it without sharpness, genuinely, the way you ask someone if they understand something you need them to actually understand. Because I've seen people go through this expecting a clear ending, a moment where justice lands like a gavel and everything is resolved, and when it doesn't happen that way, they come apart. It's not going to come apart, I said. Nathan spent 2 years knowing this was going to be ugly and incomplete and take longer than it should. He built the case anyway. I looked at her. I can do the same? She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Not with satisfaction exactly, with something more like respect, which felt more real. Elias and I ate dinner that night at a small Vietnamese restaurant 3 blocks from the hotel. His suggestion, which surprised me slightly, and then didn't. We ordered too much food and ate most of it in the particular silence of 2 people who have been through something together and don't need to perform conversation. Halfway through the meal, he said, "How are you actually doing?" "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "Ask me in a week." "I'll ask you in a week," he said. I put down my fork. I keep thinking about Nathan carrying all of this alone. 2 years. He knew what his family was. He knew what had been done. To the Crow family. To the people his grandfather cheated on those tax records. To the integrity of everything the trust was supposed to represent. And he woke up every morning and ate his cereal and drove his old car and went to work and carried it. I shook my head. I was right there. For 2 years I was right there, and he didn't let me share it. He was protecting you, Elias said. I know he was, I said. That's not actually a comfort. Being protected from something that was your business to share in, that's not kindness, it's isolation. Even if it comes from love. I looked at my plate. I've been angry at him about that, since I read the letter. I've been angry at him for not telling me, and I can't even tell him. Elias was quiet for a moment. My father did the same thing, he said finally. When everything fell apart, when they came after his credibility, when we lost the house, he carried most of it. He tried to keep my mother and me from the worst of it. He turned his water glass slowly in his hands. I spent years being angry at him for that too, for not letting us be in it fully, for deciding alone what we could handle. Did you ever stop being angry? I understood it better, he said, which isn't the same thing, but it helps. He looked up. The people who love us and try to spare us the hard parts, they're wrong to do it. But the reason they're wrong is because they love us too much and trust our strength too little. That's a specific kind of mistake. It's not the same as not caring. I looked at him across the small table in that small restaurant, this man who had spent 30 years in the gravity of his father's sacrifice, who had come to a train station in a worn-out coat with a folder of evidence and the particular patience of someone who had learned to wait because waiting was the only thing left. "Thank you," I said, "for being on that platform." He shook his head slightly. "I've been at that station a dozen times," he said, "watching people go through who were connected to the estate, relatives, attorneys, representatives, waiting for someone who was going to actually go in and fight." He paused. "Most of them were already bought or scared or both. You came in with labeled folders and you were 40 minutes early." Despite everything, I laughed. A short, real laugh that surprised both of us. "Nathan's habits," I said. "Good habits," Elias said. Raymond Holloway's criminal defense attorney issued a statement the following morning that said, essentially, that his client had acted in good faith on the advice of legal counsel regarding the estate restructuring, that the documentation issues were the result of administrative error, and that Mr. Holloway looked forward to cooperating fully with any official inquiry. Patricia read it to me over the phone and said, "Administrative error. They're going with administrative error." "For a forged signature?" I said. "For a forged signature," she confirmed. "It won't hold, but it buys time, and time is what they're buying." What came next was not a single dramatic moment. It was a sequence of bureaucratic realities that unfolded over days and then weeks, each one significant in its own right, but none of them carrying the clean narrative weight of a verdict delivered in one blow. The State Financial Crimes Division formally opened an investigation. The county court issued a preservation order on all documents held by Greer, Calloway, and Associates relating to the Holloway estate. Gerald Calloway placed himself on voluntary leave from his firm, which Patricia said meant he was cooperating to some degree, though the exact nature of that cooperation was confidential. Harwick Capital Group was referred to the Delaware State Attorney General's office for investigation of its registration and activity. 3 of the accounts identified in Torres's preliminary review were formally flagged, which meant they couldn't be touched. And the estate, Nathan's estate, the real one, all $4.3 million of it, was placed under court supervision pending resolution of the formal proceedings, with me as the court-recognized primary beneficiary. I was in Harwick for 9 days in total. By the time I took the train back home, I had signed approximately 40 documents, all reviewed by Patricia, none of them the kind Calloway had wanted me to sign on day one, and had given 2 formal statements to Torres's office and one to a federal financial crimes investigator who had gotten involved when the shell company structure turned out to cross state lines in ways that created federal jurisdiction. The morning I left, Elias walked with me to the station. We stood on the platform, the same kind of platform where this had all started, though a different city, different light. And I looked at him and tried to figure out what to say. There wasn't a version of thank you that felt sufficient. There wasn't a way to summarize what the last 9 days had been, what they'd meant, what had been found, and what had been broken open, and what had been confirmed about my husband that I'd needed to know, even though knowing it hurt. "What will you do now?" I asked him. He looked down the track. "Stay in Harwick for a while. Torres may need me to give additional context on the original documents, and I need to think." He paused. "I've been moving toward this for so long that I don't entirely know what forward looks like when it's not aimed at this." "That's honest," I said. "It's terrifying," he said, with a flatness that made it more real rather than less. "When you figure out what forward looks like," I said, "I'd like to know." He looked at me. "I'll tell you," he said. And he meant it. Not as a polite thing to say at a departure, but as an actual commitment, which is different, and which I recognized. The train came. I picked up my bag. "Elias," I said, before I stepped on, "your father was right. He was right about all of it, from the beginning, and the fact that it took this long to matter. That's not his failure. I need you to know that I believe that." He didn't say anything for a moment. His jaw tightened once. "I know," he said. "I'm starting to believe it myself." I got on the train. The house felt different when I came back. Not wrong. The way it had felt in the weeks after Nathan died. That hollow, ringing wrongness I described to you at the beginning of all this, different in a new way. Still, waiting. I put my bag down in the hallway and stood in the kitchen and looked at the counter where the train ticket had been, where I had almost not gone. I thought about what Patricia had said, that this would not resolve cleanly, that there would be no single gavel moment, that Raymond would fight it and it would take time. She was right. It would take time. Raymond's attorneys would file motions. There would be hearings. There would be arguments about jurisdiction and documentation and the statute of limitations on actions that were 30 years old. There would be delays and setbacks and moments when the machinery of accountability moved so slowly it felt like it had stopped entirely. But it was moving. For the first time in 30 years, it was moving in the right direction. And something else was true. Something I turned over in my mind standing in that kitchen on the first night back. Nathan had not left me that estate to make me wealthy. He had left it because he needed someone to walk through that door with the evidence he'd spent 2 years assembling, to refuse to be managed, to say the right names in the right room, and not flinch. He had left me a mission dressed up as an inheritance, and I had almost missed it entirely. There was a message on my phone from Patricia, a brief update, a date for a follow-up call, a note that Torres's office had confirmed 3 additional witnesses connected to the original Pelham and Garst documents who had agreed to speak. Things were moving. There was a message from my sister-in-law Margot, Nathan's sister, who had been at the funeral with her suspicious eyes, that said only, "I heard something happened in Harwick. Are you all right? Can we talk?" I stared at that message for a long time. Margot had known Nathan his entire life, had grown up in that family, had been at the periphery of everything that had happened, not a participant as far as I knew, but not entirely uninformed either. I didn't know yet what she knew or how long she'd known it or what she'd chosen not to say, and until I did, I couldn't know what that conversation would be. I put the phone face down on the counter. Not tonight. Tonight I was going to sit with what had been found, with what had been lost before it could be found, and with the specific, difficult shape of a grief that was no longer just about losing Nathan, but about understanding him. The parts he'd protected me from, the weight he'd carried, the thing he'd been trying to finish. I was angry at him still, for not telling me, for deciding alone. I loved him still, completely. The way you love someone whose flaws you understand clearly, and whose decency you have now seen confirmed in the most brutal possible way. Not through grand gestures, but through 2 years of quiet, dangerous, lonely work that he did because it was right, even when it cost him. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, it had started to rain. I made coffee, not from the good bag, from the store brand one that had been in the cabinet since before Nathan died, the kind he always bought, the kind I had kept buying out of the same inertia that keeps his entry in my phone contacts with a number I will never call. And I sat at the table and drank it, and I let the evening come. There was more to do. There was always more to do. But for tonight, I was here, alive, intact, in possession of the truth, which was more than Nathan had managed to give himself in the end. That had to be enough. That was going to have to be enough. Margot called again 4 days after I got home. I had been expecting it. I had also been avoiding it, which is not something I'm proud of, but avoidance is honest, and I have promised myself that honesty is the only currency I am spending from here on out. I had been home 4 days, and I had spent most of them doing practical things, answering Patricia's emails, signing documents she sent by courier, talking to Torres's office twice about additional details they needed from me. Practical things. The kind of work that keeps your hands busy while your mind tries to figure out how to handle the harder conversations. Margot's second call came on a Tuesday afternoon when I had run out of practical things and was standing in Nathan's home office, a room I had not entered in the 11 weeks since he died, looking at his desk, at the small framed photo of the two of us at the coast, at the coffee mug he used that I hadn't moved because moving it felt too final. At the books on the shelf that I knew, now, some of which he must have been reading not for pleasure but for research, for the long, careful work of building a case no one had asked him to build, but someone had needed to. I answered the phone. "Vanessa," Margot said. Her voice was different from the funeral, less contained, Something in it was loose in a way that suggested she'd been sitting with whatever she was about to say for a while and had worked past the point of managing it. I need to talk to you, in person if you're willing. I know that's a lot to ask right now. You can come here, I said. Come this weekend. She drove 4 hours on a Saturday morning and arrived looking like a woman who hadn't slept properly in weeks, which I recognized because I had looked the same way in the mirror for most of the last 3 months. She was 61, 3 years older than Nathan had been, with his same coloring and a version of his same careful way of moving through rooms. She stood in my kitchen and looked around like she was measuring something. I made coffee. We sat. How much did you know? I asked her. I didn't have the patience for a long approach. Not anymore. Margot wrapped both hands around her mug. Not all of it, she said. I want to be clear about that. I didn't know about the forgery. I didn't know about Harwick Capital Group. I didn't know the specific structure of what Raymond and Calloway were doing. She paused. But I knew the family had a history. I knew what Grandfather Garrett was. I knew there had been something with an employee decades ago, someone who'd been pushed out. Nathan and I talked about it once, years ago, and then never again because he shut it down. You know how he was. I know how he was, I said. When he died, she said, and her voice caught briefly, I started thinking about what he might have left behind, whether he'd been working on something. I went through some things at his office, the one at the consulting firm, not here, and I found some notes. Not the full picture, just fragments. Enough to know he was looking at the estate, at Raymond, at the trust. She looked at me. I should have called you then. I didn't because I was scared, and I'm telling you that directly, so you know I'm not pretending otherwise. Scared of what? I asked. Of Raymond, she said flatly. Of what he's capable of when he feels cornered. Of the money and the attorneys and the way that family has always operated. She looked at her hands. I have a daughter, Vanessa. I have a son-in-law and 2 grandchildren, and I live on what my husband left me. I am not in a position to take on Raymond Holloway and win. You're not, I said. But I was. She looked up. Yes, she said, and I'm sorry I didn't give you the chance sooner. We sat with that for a moment. Margot, I said, did Nathan ever tell you he was sick? That his blood pressure was elevated? That he was struggling? She was quiet for too long. He mentioned it once, she said finally, about 8 months before he died. We had lunch. He looked tired, and I said so, and he said he was fine, just managing some things. I pushed, and he said his blood pressure had been up, and the doctor had it under control. She set her mug down. He also said, and this is the part I've been carrying since you went to Harwick, he said, I need to finish something before anything happens, Margot. I'm trying to finish something. Her voice broke slightly on the last sentence. I asked him what. He said he'd tell me when it was done. The kitchen was very quiet. Nathan had known. He'd known his health was precarious, and he'd been racing the clock, and he'd said as much to his sister and still hadn't told me. And I sat with that information the way you sit with something that is painful and true and complicated and does not resolve cleanly into either anger or forgiveness, but lives somewhere between them, permanent and real. He loved you more than he trusted himself to protect you, Margot said. That's what I believe. He thought if he told you, you'd carry it with him, and he didn't want that for you. He was wrong, I said. He was, she said. But he was also Nathan. So. The investigation formally expanded in its 4th week. Torres called to tell me that the Federal Financial Crimes Unit had confirmed jurisdiction over the multi-state shell company structure, and that the case was now a joint investigation between state and federal authorities. Gerald Calloway had entered into a cooperation agreement, the details of which were not disclosed to me, but whose existence Patricia confirmed meant he was providing testimony in exchange for some form of consideration on his own exposure, which meant the case against Raymond had just gotten significantly stronger from the inside. Raymond's attorneys filed 2 motions in the first month. Both were denied. In the second month, a civil suit was filed on behalf of the estate against Raymond Holloway, Diane Holloway, and the now dissolved Harwick Capital Group for the recovery of the transferred assets. Patricia filed it. It was precise and it was comprehensive, and it named specific dollar amounts and specific dates and specific mechanisms. And when I read the draft before she filed it, I had the strange experience of seeing Nathan's 2 years of quiet work finally given a formal shape. All those months of research and documentation and careful assembly laid out in legal language, stripped of the loneliness it had cost him and reduced to its essential truth, which was damning enough without any of the human weight. Elias called me in the third week. He was still in Harwick, as he'd said he would be. Torres's team had needed him several times for context on the original documents, for background on the Crow family history, for the specific chain of custody on Dolan Crow's records that established their evidentiary value. His voice on the phone sounded different from the train, from the hotel, from the station platform, less compressed, like something that had been held under pressure for a very long time was very slowly, carefully being released. Torres told me something, he said. Off the record. She said the original fraud, the Garst-era records, my father's documentation, is likely to be included in the formal case as historical context for the current pattern of conduct, which means my father's name goes into an official federal record as the person who identified and tried to report what was happening. I held the phone and didn't say anything for a moment. Elias, I said. I know, he said. His voice was rough in a way he didn't try to smooth. I know. He was right, I said. It's on record now. Yeah, he said. And then he was quiet for a while, and I let him be quiet because some things need space and don't need words pressed into them. Chuck. The conversation with Raymond came at the 5-month mark. I didn't expect it, and I didn't want it. And Patricia strongly advised against it when I told her he had requested to speak with me directly. Not through attorneys, not in a formal setting, just a phone call. I thought about it for 2 days. Then I called him. He answered on the second ring. Thank you, he said, and I could tell immediately that this Raymond was different from every version I'd encountered before. Not the warmth as strategy Raymond of the sidewalk outside Calloway's office, not the cold, cornered Raymond of the conference room. Something had gone out of him. Whether it was the legal reality closing in or something more human than that, I couldn't say with certainty. Say what you need to say, I told him. I'm not calling to ask you to drop anything, he said. I want to be clear about that. My attorneys have already told me that ship has sailed, and they're right. A pause. I'm calling because I want to tell you something that isn't in any document and won't be. I waited. Nathan came to me, Raymond said, about 14 months before he died. He came to my office in person. He told me he knew what grandfather had done. He knew what I had been continuing, and he gave me a choice. He said if I stopped, returned what had been moved, restructured the accounts cleanly, came forward voluntarily, he wouldn't pursue it further. My hand tightened on the phone. He gave you a way out, I said slowly. He sat across from me in my office and gave me a way out, Raymond said. He said he didn't want his family destroyed. He said he'd spent a long time deciding whether to pursue this and that this was his compromise. Stop now, make it right, and he'd let it go. And you said no, I said. I told him he was bluffing, Raymond said. I told him he didn't have enough, and that even if he did, no one would believe the word of a man with an obvious personal interest over a documented legal structure that had been in place for decades. He stopped. I also told him that he looked tired and should see a doctor. The cruelty of that landed with full weight. You knew he was sick, I said. I suspected, Raymond said. He didn't look well, and after he left my office, I'm telling you this because I need to say it to someone, and you're the only one who has the right to hear it. After he left, I accelerated the transfers, because I thought if he was sick, time was on my side. I sat in Nathan's chair, at Nathan's desk, with the small framed photo of the two of us at the coast right in front of me. You knew he was trying to stop you, and you sped up because you thought he was dying, I said. Yes, Raymond said. The word was small and flat, and he didn't try to dress it up. And when he died, you thought it was over. Yes. And then I got on a train. A long pause. I underestimated Nathan, Raymond said. I underestimated what he meant to you, and I want you to know that I understand now what I actually did, not just the legal part of it. His voice had something in it I hadn't heard before, something I wasn't sure Raymond Holloway had ever exercised much in his 61 years. It wasn't remorse exactly. It was closer to reckoning. The specific feeling of being forced to see yourself clearly after a very long time of choosing not to. I let my grandfather make me into something I didn't have to be, and then I chose to keep being it. I didn't say anything for a moment. Raymond, I said finally, I'm not calling this off. I want to be perfectly clear about that. I know, he said. But I heard you, I said. What you just said? I heard it. I hung up. I sat in Nathan's chair for a long time after that, looking at the photo. The two of us at the coast. We'd been in our early 40s. We'd rented a house with another couple for a week. It had rained 3 of the 7 days, and we hadn't cared. We'd walked on the beach in rain gear and eaten too much and laughed at things I can't even remember now. Nathan in that photo is squinting slightly because the sun had come out for about 20 minutes, and he was facing it, and his hand is at the back of my neck. And we both look like people who have no idea what's coming, which of course we didn't. Nobody ever does. The civil suit settled at the 8-month mark. Raymond Holloway and the entities associated with him returned $1.4 million to the estate. Not everything, not quite, because settlements never return everything, because the machinery of negotiation always shaves something off the edges. But enough that the full estate value, once the court supervision was lifted, was confirmed at just over $4 million. Raymond also entered a plea agreement on 2 counts of financial fraud in the federal criminal case. His attorneys negotiated it down from the full exposure, which is how these things work, which is a fact about the world that I have made my peace with imperfectly and probably always will. He did not go to prison. He paid substantial fines, was barred from serving as an officer or director of any financial entity, and was ordered to complete 200 hours of community financial literacy service, which felt almost satirical given what he'd done, but was what the agreement said. Gerald Calloway lost his law license. That felt more proportionate. Diane Holloway cooperated with investigators in exchange for immunity on the civil charges, which meant she walked away from the Harwick Capital Group liability. I have feelings about that. I am keeping those feelings in a room inside myself that I don't open very often, because the alternative is to let them run my choices, and I refuse to let Raymond's family run my choices any more than they already have. What happened next was the part that nobody predicted, including me. Patricia and I met in Harwick in the 9th month to finalize the estate transfer. I brought Elias. He had been in Harwick the whole time. He had found a room, found work doing bookkeeping for a small construction company, the irony of which was not lost on either of us, and had stayed because Torres still needed him occasionally, and because I think he didn't yet know where else to go. We sat in Patricia's office, not Calloway's polished conference room, but Patricia's actual working office, which was comfortable in the way that real places are comfortable, worn in the right ways, full of the evidence of years of actual work. And Patricia walked us through the final numbers. $4.1 million, cleared, confirmed, mine. I looked at those numbers for a long time, and then I said, I want to establish a foundation. Patricia looked at me over her reading glasses. I've been thinking about this for months, I said. Nathan's money, the legitimate part of it, what his grandfather built before Garrett corrupted it, what Nathan grew honestly through 30 years of careful work. I don't need $4 million. I need enough to live on without fear, enough to be secure, enough to not have to worry about the mortgage. I looked at her. The rest of it should do what Nathan was trying to do. It should correct something. What kind of foundation? Patricia asked. 2 things, I said. First, a fund for people who were financially harmed by the original Holloway fraud. Dolan Crow documented enough in those boxes to identify at least some of them, and Torres's investigation has surfaced more. People who were defrauded on those original tax structures, whose business dealings with Garrett Holloway's entities cost them money they never recovered. They should get something back. I paused. Second, a fund for people in exactly the position Dolan Crow was in 30 years ago. Whistleblowers, people who reported financial misconduct and paid for it. Legal support, financial bridge funding while they're fighting, the kind of structural help that might have changed what happened to Dolan. The room was quiet. Elias was looking at me with an expression I couldn't entirely decode, something that was full and complicated and very carefully held. Vanessa, Patricia said, that's a significant portion of the estate. I know what it is, I said. I've done the math. I'm keeping enough. Nathan kept enough for us for 22 years. I can manage on less than he did. This will take time to structure properly, she said. I've got time, I said. Nathan ran out of it. I didn't. Patricia took her glasses off and looked at me steadily. I want to be your foundation's legal counsel, she said. Pro bono for the first year. I was going to ask you, I said. Good, she said, and put her glasses back on. I looked at Elias. He had been quiet through all of this, and his quiet was the kind that contains more than silence. The kind that means someone is processing something too large for immediate words. The Crow name, I said to him. I want it on the foundation. With your permission. The Dolan Crow Fund for Accountability. His jaw did the thing I had seen it do before, tightening once, a single controlled moment of something getting through the surface. You don't need my permission for that, he said. I'm asking anyway, I said. He looked at the table, then at me. Yes, he said. Yes, use his name. Chamt. The foundation was formally established 11 months after I first boarded that train. We identified 14 individuals and 2 small businesses that had been demonstrably harmed by the Holloway fraud in its original form, most of them modestly, some of them significantly, and contacted each one. Some of them were elderly. Some had died and their families received the outreach. Several of them wept on the phone when Patricia called, because they had long ago accepted that what had been taken from them was simply gone. It wasn't gone. Elias became the foundation's first program director. This was not a decision I made out of sentimentality, and I want to be clear about that. I made it because he was the most qualified person I knew for the work. He had spent 30 years understanding exactly how these systems operated, exactly how people fell through the gaps, exactly what the difference was between having legal standing and having resources and having neither. He knew the landscape from the inside. He had lived it. He moved back to our city 8 months after the foundation launched, because most of the administrative work was based here, and because, I think, though he never said it exactly this way, because he was ready to stop being in the orbit of Harwick. He'd been circling that city for years, drawn back by the unfinished thing his father had left. The thing was finished now. He could go somewhere else. He is not the same man I met on that platform. He is still complicated, still carries things in ways he doesn't always share, still has the quality of a person whose trust was damaged early and rebuilt slowly. But he laughs more than he did. He showed up at my door one Saturday morning with 2 cups of coffee and spent 3 hours helping me reorganize Nathan's home office into a workspace for foundation business. And at some point during that process, he started talking about his father in present tense, not correcting himself, just allowing it. And I didn't say anything because it wasn't my correction to make. I want to tell you what I know now that I didn't know when I stood in that kitchen with my cold coffee, looking at a train ticket like it was something dangerous. I know that the people who are stealing from you are counting on you to be confused, to be grieving, to be too depleted to ask the right questions. They are counting on your loss to be their advantage. They have usually been running their calculations for longer than you know, and they have usually decided that you specifically are not a threat. Be a threat. I know that love, real love, is not demonstrated by the grand gestures or the speeches. Nathan never gave me a speech in 22 years. What he gave me was 2 years of quiet, exhausting, lonely work aimed at something he believed was right, carried through his own illness, maintained to the end. That is a heavier thing than words, and it is a more honest declaration of character than anything he could have said at a dinner table or across a birthday cake. I also know, and this is the part that cost me to learn, that love does not excuse the choice to carry things alone. Nathan was wrong to shut me out. His reasons were good, and his heart was right, and he was still wrong, because a partnership is not a protection arrangement. It's a shared life, and shared lives require shared weight. If you are reading this and you are carrying something alone right now because you think you are protecting someone by doing so, stop. Tell them. Let them decide what they can handle. You do not get to make that decision for the people who love you. I know that accountability is slow and incomplete and often insufficient and still worth pursuing. Raymond Holloway did not get what I would have chosen for him. Calloway lost his license but not his freedom. The full damage of 30 years of fraud cannot be fully repaired by any amount of money returned. And yet, Dolan Crow's name is on a foundation. 14 families got something back that they had accepted was gone. A federal record exists that documents the truth of what happened. Nathan's 2 years of work are not buried in a storage unit anymore. They are active. They are operating. That is not everything. It is not nothing either. I went back to Harwick once more in the Foundation's second year to speak at a small event that Torres organized, a professional development conference for financial investigators, which sounds dry and was in some ways dry, but which mattered because the people in that room were the ones who did the work that made any of this possible. Elias came with me. We took the train. We sat in the same configuration we'd been in 14 months earlier, though in different seats, heading in the same direction. The November fields moved past outside. The same flat gray-brown stretches, the same wide sky. He was reading something on his phone. I was looking out the window. "Do you think about your father differently now?" I asked him, the same question I'd asked in a different form back in the hotel room on that first night, when I was still raw from reading Nathan's letter. He thought about it. He didn't answer fast, which was one of the things I had learned to value about him. The absence of the reflex answer, the willingness to actually look at the question before responding. "I think about him more clearly," he said finally. "Before, I thought about him mostly through the lens of what was done to him. Now I think about him as the person he was before all of that started. The man who took me to baseball games and cooked better than my mother, and believed that doing the right thing consistently enough would eventually produce an accounting." He paused. He was right about everything. He was just wrong about himself. He thought he was going to be the one to see it through. He wasn't. But he built what the rest of us needed to. I looked at him. "That sounds familiar." He met my eyes. "Yeah," he said. "I know." The train moved through the gray November landscape, carrying us toward a city that had given us both things we hadn't expected, toward work that was incomplete in the way that all real work is incomplete, toward the ongoing and imperfect business of trying to make something right in a world that had spent decades making it wrong. Nathan's watch was in my coat pocket. I'd started carrying it after the Foundation launched. Not morbidly, not as a weight, but as something that kept me company. I'd had it repaired because it had stopped running sometime in the last weeks of his life, and now it kept perfect time, which was either meaningless or wasn't, depending on what you believed about such things. I believed it wasn't meaningless. I am allowed to believe that. The train moved on. Outside, the fields gave way to buildings, to the particular density of a city beginning to appear, to the ordinary afternoon of a place that looked the same as it ever had on the surface and was not at all the same underneath. Nothing was the same underneath. I put my hand in my coat pocket and held the watch and felt it ticking, steady and patient, and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened, keeping time the way time keeps itself. Without drama, without pause, without any awareness of what it costs the people who live inside it. "Forward," it said, "just forward." That was enough.